Okay, so I promise I'm going to make this a little bit shorter of a video than I normally have been, but wanted to respond to question number 8 about PMDD and the DSM and diagnosing women with premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So a lot of you kind of jumped on board with this idea that it's a misogynistic construction and that there's potential ramifications for issues of power and oppression for women if we're going to use that as a label for their experience. And a lot of you noted, like, this is something that's biological that women experience, so how can it be diagnosed as a mental health concern? Some of you suggested that maybe it should be a medical diagnosis rather than a mental health diagnosis. And some of you really expressed sort of that in between. Maybe it sort of speaks to someone's experience in some way and validates what they're going through. And then for others, maybe it pathologizes their experience in a lot of ways that are detrimental to them. So I could review sort of all those things. And I think I appreciate a lot of your tentativeness about not necessarily just jumping on board with one perspective in particular. But there were a couple comments that some of you made that stood out particularly to me and made me think of some ideas that I wanted to just put out there for reflection. And that has to do with how we talk about experience and then how people experience what's happening in their bodies. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by that in just a second. But one of the things, Anna Maria, you mentioned in your post, and I have my notes here, so I'm just looking for where that's at, is that it's maybe potentially society's intolerance of unpleasant symptoms that often result in them affecting us adversely. So perhaps this whole idea we have about PMS, and PMS sort of, Brenda, you spoke to this, that it's sort of like we get convinced by society that when we have this particular time of the month, and when I say we, I'm talking to women, so sorry men, but when females go through this specific time of the month, we are sort of convinced by society that we become, your words were raging beings, Brenda, and I thought that was really interesting because I think there's part of it that maybe women's cycles wouldn't be experienced in the same way if society hadn't created a story around how they're experienced, how they're expressed, what kind of effects it has on a person. And Jared, you also mentioned a point too about, in a response to someone, you said learning about a disorder can influence our experience of it. And so I even think that the messages and stories we get, not just about PMS, but then PMDD, that might also sort of invite or script an experience around how our hormonal fluctuations, women's hormonal fluctuations, impact them. And I wonder if we didn't have that story constructed, that this particular time of the month does these certain sorts of things, if experiences might not fall in line in sort of the same characteristic ways that many of us often identify them happening. So part of me just thinks, even though we can say this is a biological phenomenon and all women experience it, we also know that there's a range of ways that women experience menstruation. And it also makes me wonder if menstruation is experienced by women in specific ways because there's a story around how it is experienced or how it manifests. So we could have social constructs coming from all different directions and discourses about how this plays out in the lives of women. I also just want to throw out there, just for fun, that there are a couple people that do sort of perceive men to have their own hormonal monthly cycles as well, with testosterone levels potentially peaking around day 18 within a particular 30-day cycle. And there's one guy named Jed Diamond who's a psychiatrist, and he calls this IMS, irritable male syndrome. So not necessarily that we want to create another story about how hormones adversely affect our experience of ourselves, relationships, in the world. But there are some people, another person is an endocrinologist named Peter Selleck, and he also believes that men have a testosterone cycle that sort of replicates a monthly cycle that women experience, and that it also impacts mood and behavior and things like that. There's no conclusive evidence about that, and clearly women have been the focus of study more so than men. And men have been the ones, many of you mentioned this, men are the ones that are often writing about these disorders and also studying females when it comes to these specific experiences. But just some interesting thoughts. I appreciate all of the discussion and dialogue that you guys are having, and also appreciate that people are not wanting to write something off completely, not wanting to buy into something completely, but are also just holding it open for a little bit of inviting the client into making meaning and sense of it and however might be most useful to them.